So most people say, well, it's grass-fed, except a little bit. We put a little bit of grain in at the end, rah, rah, rah. So I have this saying that I like to say is that 100% grass-fed beef is really, it's equivalent to pregnancy. In other words, you can't be sort of, kind of, almost pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. And that's how I feel about 100% grass-fed beef. You can't be sort of, kind of, almost 100% grass-fed beef. But currently, there's no regulation, and but the reality is, there's all kinds of scenarios.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We're just about to begin. I would like to start by introducing Ridge, whom I've known since around 2014, when Biodiversity for a Livable Climate was just getting started. Ridge is the founder and CEO of Big Picture Beef and a leader in the shift away from feedlot beef to raising cattle on 100% grass forages. No corn ever. And he uses regenerative pasturing and grazing management that sequesters carbon deep underground. Currently, he is developing a large-scale supply of 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef in the Northeast United States. This program will provide economic opportunities for existing small farmers in the region and safe, nutritionally superior Northeast beef for Northeast markets, all while improving soil fertility and water retention and combating climate change. Ridge was the founding director of the New England Livestock Alliance, co-founder of Hardwick Beef, and co-founder of the Rotokawa Cattle Company. If you haven't heard of Rotokawa Cattle, you will hear about it. He has consulted all over the United States and New Zealand, Uruguay, and Argentina on beef production and ecosystem restoration through grazing. His work has been recognized in Time Magazine, Atlantic Monthly, New York Times, Wine Spectator, and Smithsonian, and also at Biodiversity for a Livable Climate conferences. So, Rich, take it away.
Okay, great. I think we got some slides coming up here. So first of all, I'd like to just thank Adam, Paula, and the folks at WGBH for the opportunity to talk about these things. I think it's critically important. And, you know, the main takeaway that I really hope you all end up with by the end of this talk is that there's been, cattle have been demonized as the problem with climate change. And I want to make the case that cattle actually, if they're grazed correctly, are an incredible solution to climate change. And that's, you know, that's my hypothesis, and hopefully I can color that out for you as we go along. Next slide, please. So, you know, someone suggested I start with where I learned to farm. So I like to tell people I learned to farm in the 1800s. I'm not really that old, but in about 45 years ago, I worked at a museum in Massachusetts called Old Sturbridge Village. And there, what we were trying to do is replicate the time period from the 1790s to the 1830s. It was the beginning of what we call living history, where we tried to replicate the the artifacts, the plow, the ox cart, and the livestock, and then replicate the farmer's year. So that was the learning environment where I worked. That's actually me on top of the haystack. And at the same time, I lived on a so-called modern dairy farm where we worked, we milked about 125 cows a day. So it was an interesting juxtaposition of the two methodologies, 1800s versus modern. And one of the things that we did, as well as replicate the tools and everything, is tried to replicate the animals. That was kind of the beginning of the heritage breeds, which are so popular now. But we kind of were in on the the ground on that. But anyway, that gives you a little bit of color of where I kind of get some of my knowledge, maybe 40 years ago. Next slide, please. But one of the things I stumbled onto about 20 years ago was 100% grass-fed beef. And what we discovered as we began to harvest cattle that had only eaten grass is that there was huge variability. Some of the meat was great. some was terrible, some was inedible. And as we began the odyssey of trying to figure that all out, eventually we learned how to do it. And so this is a steak that we sent to a guy who's a pretty famous guy, Dan Barber, executive chef at Blue Hills at Stone Barn. And he's a guy that's embraced the farm to table movement from day one. And I called him a while back and said, Dan, you got to taste one of my steaks. And he goes, you're not local enough. It's got to be hyper local. And I said, come on, Dan, I'm not trying to sell you. Just taste the steak. Anyway, this is the quote he sent us. The beef was unbelievable, among the best we've ever had. Just stood around amazed at the fat. Anyway, long story short, of course, he called me up and said, Rich, he said, I know you only fed it grass, but how in the hell did you make such a great piece of steak? And I said, Dan, it's really all about the energy in the grass. It's about harvesting the energy from the grass and getting the cattle eat the energy to lay in the fat that creates the taste and the quality. And we'll return to more of that, but the next slide. So one of the things that is challenging in the Northeast, if you live in the Northeast, if you've driven around, you've seen these buildings. Almost every town, if you drive out of the city, drive toward the country, whether it's Maine, whether it's the Champlain Valley, whether it's central New York, you'll see buildings, you'll see houses that used to be very fancy farmhouses with all kinds of trim and everything, and public buildings that were beautiful buildings that have fallen into disrepair. These buildings were built by the rural economy. So there was a vibrant rural economy, and it's gone. And one of the downsides of that is we have farmers who are really desperate. We have high rates of suicide, higher than vets returning from battle. In Iraq and places like that, and it's really a very sad story that our rural economy has eroded. Next slide. But the reality is a lot of our land has become unused, vacant, or not farmed. And so you see a lot, if you drive around in the countryside, you see a lot of farms, a lot of land that has goldenrod growing on it. Goldenrod is a sign of the succession from goldenrod to brush to eventually trees. At the same time, you see periodically cattle grazing on the land. And one of the interesting things in the Northeast is that we have incredible unfair advantage versus other parts of the country. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I was having dinner in New York City with Bill Nyman, and another guy, chef, was cooking for us. And after about 3 hours, Bill Nyman looked over at me and he said, Rich, for a Yankee, an awful lot about cattle. And I said, well, geez, I'll take that as a compliment. He said, but you can't raise cattle out here in the East. You got to raise them out where the cattle are raised. I said, but wait, Bill. How many acres does it take to support a bovine in your environment? And he says, 15, 20 acres per cow. And I said, but Bill, it only takes us 1 or 2 acres per cow because we have dairy quality soils and we have rain. So if we have a drought, we only get 30 inches of rain. Out west, they might never get more than 15 inches of rain. So it's a huge unfair advantage. And then I said to him, and here's the kicker, Bill, where's the market? He said, well, you got me. So the market is here in the East. Next slide, please. So one of the things in the Northeast is you have grass-fed beef is in every store, in every retail store. And because the consumers are demanding 100% grass-fed beef. So this is a picture that I took of a alternative meat case in one of it's a chain store, about 60 stores. I'm not going to give the name of it, but it was a picture that I wanted to take to show you what's available, the different options in a typical alternative meat case. And what's interesting about this meat case is that everything in this meat case that's 100% grass-fed beef came from Australia or Uruguay. There's not a single piece of meat in there that came from the USA. Now, this is confusing for the consumer. I'm thrilled that the consumers have embraced grass-fed beef, but the fact is 80 to 90%, 70 to 80%, a whole bunch of the grass-fed beef that's in the meat case is imported. And how it happens is the meat comes to the US in a container, not quite as big as the container that was just stuck in the Suez, but a big, big ship full of meat. It's landed in the Port of Boston, Port of Philadelphia, wherever it lands, and then the meat is moved to a processor like this one in Sutton, Massachusetts. And the meat is ground, 300,000 pounds per day. They grind it and they put it in these bricks that go to the retail stores. Because they grind it in the USA, they can actually write on the package, product of USA. That's the law. It's an obscenity, but that's the law. So you as a consumer go in, you say, great, grass-fed beef. Great, product USA. But it's not product USA. It was grown in Uruguay or Australia. But anyway, it's a huge issue, and it's going to take smart consumers to unravel it and go to their retailer and say, look, I know this is 100% grass-fed, but I want it from USA and local, regional. Anyway, the next slide. So this is the region that we work out of. So we've described our region as the Northeast, equivalent to what the USDA calls the Northeast, which is New England, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and West Virginia. It's a huge area, all kinds of retail, hospitals, colleges, 70 million people, most densely populated area of the country, and a very rich area of the country. But this is the area that we pull our livestock out of, and it's a big region of the country and a huge market. The challenge, like I said, is that a lot of the market is supplied from elsewhere, not from the US. Next slide, please. So here's, now we're going to get into the nitty gritty of our grazing method and why it's important and how it's different than conventional. So we call it adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And in reality, what we're trying to mimic is the buffalo. So you see the picture on the left is the buffalo. See the picture on the right is cattle grazing grass. So, I always like to say when we're talking about this, to kind of give people a picture. So at one point in history, talking about cows as the problem, there were over 60 million buffalo in this country. And there also was the prairie, very, very deep soils, 8, 9, 10 feet deep soil, tall grass 6 feet tall. And I always say to people, I say, well, how do you think that happened? The 60 million buffalo in the prairie. You think the prairie was perfected and those 60 million buffalo parachuted into the prairie? Or do you think the buffalo were wandering around with no grass on a dry lot and the prairie parachuted in? Well, the reality is, of course, that there was a symbiosis of the large herbivore, the grass, photosynthesis, the sun, carbon, and carbon being stored in the soils, that this whole process created those deep soils because of the way the buffalo moved. So here's the situation. Say you have a huge herd like this of buffalo. They move along, they eat, manure, urine, and trampled grass, and then they move. And they don't come back until that grass is grown back. So that's the methodology that we're trying to replicate by using electric fence and cattle to create the same situation. And what happens, we find out, we call it adaptive multi-paddock grazing. We find that we actually build soil rapidly. We store lots of carbon and water, and we do it, with electric fence. So the cattle lined up. The cattle love to be together. They love being in a group, and they move as we move the fence. And our goal is to let the grass grow tall enough so that we have energy available to the cattle that are trying to get fat. Next slide. This is not a video in this presentation, but on our website, it is video that you can go and see. This is a guy, NRCS, who did basically looking at water infiltration and its relationship to grazing. So, basically a perk test. He puts a piece of pipe in the ground, pours some water in, and measures how long it takes to go away. So he did three adjacent scenarios. One was a perk test on corn land. So corn land was planted with the best possible methodology, no-till planted and that kind of thing. The second scenario was extensively grazed land where the cattle just get put out all summer long and they just wander around in the same area all summer long. Typically then when a plant grows, they go over and eat it off. And then the third scenario, of course, is the way we do it, adaptive multi-paddock grazing. So in the first scenario, he pours the water in on the corn land. It takes 30 minutes to percolate. So the corn land is impervious. Now you have to imagine that there's whole states of corn land, Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, whole states that are 96 to 97% corn. So do we wonder why the Mississippi floods? The land is impervious. The water can't go in, runs downhill, runs to the river, and ends up flooding. So then he moves over to the extensively grazed land, which is how a lot of grazing is done in the West, and dramatically better, 7 minutes to percolate. Then he moves over to the adaptive multi-paddock grazed land, and remarkably, 10 seconds for the water to percolate. So this is incredible. If we want to talk about flooding, weird weather, the water cycle, which we all need water, a lot more than we need beef. This is a way to heal the land, get the water to penetrate the land. It penetrates because the land is porous, because there's carbon in it. And carbon then, because it's like a sponge, it'll absorb 6 to 7 times its weight in the soil and then release it slow. So the way you learn in high school biology, transpiration goes up and it all works. But our weather system is broken mainly because of corn and how we've poisoned the land, killed the microbes, made the ground impervious to water or health. Okay, move forward. Next slide. So one of the things we had to do grass-fed beef was to figure out how to find the right kind of cattle for success on a forage-only diet. So we used a number of methodologies. We actually used an ultrasound machine. We can actually measure the cattle and look inside the animal at the intermuscular fat and the tenderness of the animal. And then we also had some tools that we used were linear measurement tools. So we actually had calipers and physical ways to measure the animal, measure the heart girth and all these things and determine whether the animal was functional on grass. One of the interesting things as the more I learned about this, I got back and realized that seen some of these slides years ago in the Museum of Cattle. And, I always thought the artist was drunk or something, small head, tiny feet, big body. But then, of course, we found some of these. Next slide. So this is an animal we found in Massachusetts, but precisely the right type for getting fat on a grass-only diet. These cattle just look at grass and get fat. Next slide. And of course, we found the bulls that we could pair with the cows to get phenomenal calves for function on grass. We could spend all day on genetics. Next slide. But to explain our system, so in the Northeast, there's over 600,000 calves born every year. The vast majority of them go west to the feedlots, get fed on corn and grain, and come back into our markets as meat. Most of these farms have 40 head, most of the small farms that have 40 head. And then, so our concept is that we have all these small farms that have 40 head. We gather the cattle together and we finish them in a large herd on a finishing farm that's 100% grass, like the buffalo. Next slide. So here's your typical herd with 40 head. You know, mixed genetics, but all British genetics is what we want in terms of having a good quality piece of meat. British meaning Angus, Hereford, Devon, Galloway, et cetera, et cetera. But there's over 600,000 born in the Northeast in these little herds. So we gather with them together, aggregate them, and instead of sending them to the feedlot in the West, we bring them to a finishing farm. Next slide. This is our one of our finishing farms in Vermont. It's about 850 head in this paddock in, you know, moving into the next paddock. But it's a big group of cattle. And you can see the grass is tall and we're harvesting energy in this scenario. Okay, so next slide. Yeah, so one of our challenges with you know, doing this on at a local level is that when we harvest an animal, and this picture of me with a side of beef, well, we have to sell all the parts of the animal. And the chart to the right, you know, one of the things we ran into when we first started selling meat is everybody would say, oh, we want the ribeyes, we want the strips, we want the tenderloins. So I actually made this chart to show that only about 8% of the animal is ends up being in those steaks. So we have a lot of ground beef, we have brisket, we have all these other parts. And so that's part of the challenge with selling local, and we have to explain this to our customers because they cannot call us up and order a tractor trailer load of filet. We don't have enough animals to make that happen. So it's just part of the scenario. Next slide. Anyway, this is actually Mark and Cheryl who own that big finishing farm where we sell a big herd of cattle. But what our business is to you know, help farmers figure out how to do this and then provide a market for their cattle. Next slide. This is the one, you know, once you embrace all the good reasons for grass-fed beef, you know, save the environment, best for your health, high vitamins, great omega-3s, et cetera, everybody comes up against price. So I just put this up here so you can see, compared to a Snicker bar, you know, we're actually about half the price of a Snicker bar for a pound of ground grass-fed beef. Anyway, or an ounce of grass-fed beef. Okay, next slide. We're kind of running short on time, but I would just read this one quote because I think it's fascinating. This is a quote from Henry Wallace, who was the Secretary of Agriculture in 1933 to 1941. And this is what he says: grass will act as the great balance wheel and stabilizer to prevent gluts of other crops, to save soil from destruction, to build up a reserve of nutrients and moisture in the soil, ready for any future emergency, to create a more prosperous livestock industry, and finally, to contribute to the health of our people through better nutrition. That just says it all, and that was a long time ago. So anyway, that's it. I think one more slide, just a placeholder, showing you how you can get in touch with us and visit our website.
Okay, Rich, thank you for that great introduction to grass-fed beef in New England. And I'd like to ask you a couple of questions that I think will be of interest to our audience, starting with, you mentioned omega-3s, and there's a lot of talk, I would venture to say mythology, about how healthy or unhealthy beef is, and a lot of that revolves around the essential fatty acids in beef. Can you talk about that a little bit and how grass-fed and feedlot beef compare in that regard?
Certainly. Yeah. So everybody's heard of omega-6 and omega-3. And what's critically important is the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. So what's interesting is both, as Adam said, are essential fatty acids. You need omega-6, you need omega-3. You just need them in the right ratio. And what's interesting, we've done a lot of testing at Clemson University. We've sent samples of our steaks of our meat, and she'll precipitate all the fats out and measure that ratio. And what's interesting is when she did that, we had like 8 samples, and they range from select to prime, which if you don't understand what that means, it means high percentage of fat. And she called me up and she said, Ridge, I don't understand. These cattle are all fat, and yet I can see from the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, you didn't feed them any grain. And again, back to the story of harvesting the energy in the grass to create the fat. But the omega-6, omega-3 ratio is something like a fingerprint. So if the cattle ate grain, they'd have 10 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. The grass is like 1.2 to 1. And that ratio is critical to human health. So a lot of the bad rap that red meat has, it's not the cattle so much as it's the grain that skewed that omega-6, omega-3 ratio.
And just to point out that in general, omega-3 oils are considered anti-inflammatory, and omega-6 oils are pro-inflammatory, so that if you have an excess of omega-6s, you're going to be much more susceptible to inflammation, and there's a lot of inflammation in our current disease picture. Right. So another question. Oh, and one more thing. The essential fatty acids are essential because we cannot manufacture them in our bodies, and neither can the cattle. And they get them from the grass, and that's how we get them, via the cattle.
Right.
Another question is, do you want to talk a little bit about one of your earlier adventures in taking a long trip with some, at that time, unusual animals?
Oh, yeah. What Adam's referring to is at one point I imported 87 animals from New Zealand. One of the things that was interesting in our odyssey of figuring this all out is we did a lot of, like I said, ultrasounding and linear measurement around the country. And we stumbled across this one breed, the Devon breed, which I knew about from working at Old Sturbridge Village. But the beef Devon is genetically the same as the dairy Devon, but very different physically. And we were looking for the beef Devon, and we found a number of cows that were gorgeous, but we couldn't find the bulls that we were looking for by this linear measurement methodology. So my partner and I had a little bit of money from a conference I ran. I sent my partner to New Zealand and Australia to look for bulls, because those are the only countries we can import genetics from. And we found this phenomenal herd, and we imported semen, and we started breeding our cows to that semen. And then years later, the guy who was the manager of the ranch called me up one day, and he said, look, he said, I'm quitting, and they're going to fire sale the herd. Do you want the herd? And I said, well, of course I want the herd. He said, well, you got to figure it out. So anyway, long story short, I built my own USDA approved quarantine center in California, 1,000 acres, flew the 87 animals in on 747s and quarantined them there, and eventually moved them back to Massachusetts. So the herd exists in Massachusetts. A couple of years off my life, but the genetics are a remarkable set of genetics for grass. And what's interesting is they're so unrelated to most of the other breeds that are in the US that we get this incredible rap of hybrid vigor. When you breed unrelated breeds together, you get hybrid vigor. 15-20% increase in productivity. So they're very useful as a terminal sire in that relationship. Anyway, that probably answers your question.
Yeah, it was quite an early adventure for you. I had an interesting experience with in my days of surveying grass-fed beef process, and I came across this video of I don't know if you'd call it a ranch in Ireland, but it was a facility where they had these long rows of stalls for the cattle, and they had a big machine that went out and harvested grass in the fields and put it into its bins, and then drove down the stalls in this big barn or whatever it was, and automatically put the grass into the stalls where the cattle were, and that was grass-fed beef.
Right.
So that should be something of a warning that if you really want good, real grass-fed beef, that because the soil and the grazing and all of that are extremely important, you should make sure that whatever you buy says 100% pasture raised or something like that. Have you seen any, I guess I'd call them anomalies like that in your travels?
Oh, absolutely. So, the problem is that the whole industry has discovered the uh, sexiness of grass-fed. So everybody's labeled their product grass-fed. And the reality is almost all cattle eat grass for the vast majority of their lives. So if for their whole life until the last 3 months, when they go to the feedlot and eat grain, they're eating grass. So many, and there's no regulation. This day and age, there's no USDA regulation that says this is grass fed and grass finished. And that's another, the real thing is it grass fed and grass finished or grass fed? So most people say, well, it's grass fed, except for a little bit. We put a little bit of grain in at the end. Rah, rah, rah. So I have this saying that I like to say is that 100% grass fed beef is really, it's equivalent to pregnancy. In other words, you can't be sort of kind of almost pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. And that's how I feel about 100% grass-fed beef. You can't be sort of kind of almost 100% grass-fed beef. But currently there's no regulation. And but the reality is there's all kinds of scenarios. Many of the big boys get started and they build a feedlot. They start feeding distillers grain, which theoretically doesn't have any starch in it. But it does have glyphosate and all other kinds of poisons that go into the ration, that go into the meat. So it's a Wild West out there, basically, in terms of regulation, what's right. And it's hard because it's so critical for the customer to figure this out, because when you're feeding grain, we have a little saying that says, feed grain, kill soil. It's a little bit extreme, but it's also true. The way we grow grain, we kill soil. We kill soil, we screw up the water cycle, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's important for the consumers to dig in. It's very hard to do because there's an awful lot of smoke and mirrors out there attempting to obfuscate, the reality. Say, oh no, ours is good. We're grass fed, but it's a hard. But it's incumbent on the consumers to figure this out. I mean, it's the whole game. If the customers could really figure it out, they could buy American, local, 100% grass-fed. Go to your vendor and say, no, I love this grass-fed beef, but I really want something that's at least from America and more specifically from the region. And I want it to be 100%. I want it to be the real deal. But it's you got to be a very motivated consumer to do that. But hopefully people will continue to do that. I mean, that process has started. And I mean, the difference to our local economy, our local climate, our local water systems, our better weather, lack of flooding, all those things are possible. But it really requires that decision. The quote I like is Wendell Berry, who says, eating is an agricultural act. And it's just absolutely true. So every time you spend a dollar, you're making the decision that's reflected downstream. It's a hard job, but it's critical that we do it.
So we are getting better at it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, versus 20 years ago, 20 years ago was, I had to explain to the New York Times what grass-fed was. And then, of course, mad cow hit, and all of a sudden everybody said, oh, if they're eating grass, you see that thing, mad cow is where you grind up another animal and feed it to the cow. Well, guess what? If you have cattle out in a field and one of them dies, the other cows will not go eat it. Now, if you were a pig or a chicken, you'd go eat that dead cow. But another herbivore is not going to eat that cow unless you grind it up and feed it to them. So mad cow with 100% grass fed is essentially impossible. It just won't happen.
So while we're talking about dangers real or imagined, you mentioned glyphosate, and how does that come into the whole grass-fed feedlot equation?
Well, the fact is, if glyphosate, if people don't understand it, glyphosate is an agricultural poison that's used to kill weeds. And it's literally used on 96, 97% of all the corn and soy grown in this country. And basically what it does is it kills the microbes, it kills the weeds, it kills all those things. It's a huge problem for the human gut because it comes along and it kills the microbes in the human gut. So I'm probably getting distracted from your question, Adam. What was it again now? You started talking about glyphosate.
Yeah, what role does it play in this whole animal and human health equation?
Oh, yeah, no, it's a huge problem. Um, and it's everywhere. It's penetrated our food system. It's penetrated our guts. I mean, I give a talk sometimes with Stephanie Senna from MIT, and she did a peer-reviewed study that showed correlation between a number of health conditions and the agricultural use of glyphosate starting in the 1970s. And the three conditions that she documents, now she's talking about correlation, not causation, but the three conditions are Alzheimer's, autism, and ADD. And she sees a 0.99 to 1 correlation to the use of that agricultural chemical glyphosate. So she's not saying it's necessarily caused, it could be something else, but there's an incredible correlation to those health issues, which today are huge health problems. When I was a kid, you never heard of autism or Alzheimer's or ADD, but today, you have whole facilities full of people with all these conditions. So,
and by the way, glyphosate is commercially known as Roundup, for which Monsanto became famous and infamous.
right.
Why don't we switch to some of the questions from our guests? Some are pretty interesting. Tim Weiskell asks, how do you propose to oppose the anti-meat or beyond meat arguments by Bill Gates? And I'll put a link to Bill Gates in the chat here.
Oh, don't give them any more press. Come on. So the problem with the lab meats, all of them, is that essentially they take the worst case scenario of our agricultural practices. Now they're going to tell you it's the best case scenario because all the tractors are run by computers, by satellites, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is they're using grain that's grown with glyphosate and other poisons that's killing land. Then they take that grain to a lab and they manufacture it into something to sell you. So there is absolutely no positive impact on the soil. And a bunch of negatives, all these chemicals. I mean, I saw a little piece on Instagram where I had a picture of beef, Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger with the list of ingredients. So beef, there was one ingredient, beef. The others, there was like this list a mile long of all the ingredients. So if you think eating chemicals and glyphosate and the net result of having a ton of land continue to be poisoned, then it's really it's there. And but the fact is that if we embrace this alternative methodology, it would be a remarkable change, a very positive change in our rural economies, in our weather, in our flooding, and in our health, in the human health.
Okay, we have a question from James Schwab, who says, can you discuss how corn feed farming techniques in the Midwest impact water infiltration, increased flooding, and eventual runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus in the Gulf? You've already touched on that, but maybe you could elaborate a bit more.
Yeah, I could. What I tell people is I could stop the flooding in the Mississippi. I could cure the drought in the West, and I could cure the human obesity. Now, how I can do that is you have to give me the 3 states of Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana. All 3 states grow 96 to 97% corn and soy. But if we had a big herd of cattle on those 3 states, we could recreate the prairie, which would absorb the water instead of sending it down the Mississippi. But I mean, the reality is those states, and they're all bordered the big rivers that flood eventually into the Mississippi, they're just impermeable. They're impermeable because of the chemicals that have the biocides and the glyphosate and all those things that have killed the biology of the soil, which has made them impermeable. And we could change that, but it would require a huge pull on the rope by the consumers to say, no, I don't want that feedlot beef. I want this grass-fed beef. And the reality is, one of the reasons the farmers still grow corn and soy with glyphosate is it's subsidized by the government. So it's not a direct subsidy, but there's this insurance kind of scam that goes on that they can actually get paid when their crop doesn't grow if they use these methodologies. Anyway, it's the reason we have corn used in feedlots because it's cheap, and for ethanol, the government subsidizes the ethanol that forces the consumers to buy at the pump. All these things are reasons that farmers grow corn and soy. It's not like they're making $1 bazillion, but they get subsidized by the government. So it's a huge issue. I mean, if we had a subsidy that rewarded grass versus corn, I mean, this thing would change immediately.
Several questions from people about wanting to understand better the process of aggregating beef from small farms to finishing farms. And along with that, a question about, can you get, or is there progress being made in getting the supplier farms to also use adaptive multi-paddock grazing?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So the reality is, historically, across the country, calves are born on little small farms, 40 head average across the country. Everybody imagines these vast farms with thousands of cows. Not true. They come from these small farms. And what happens is that once the cows reach market age, the cattle dealer comes and picks them up, and then they aggregate them in a larger truck and they go west. What's interesting, and the way to raise cows and calves and finish cattle is very, very different from an energy point of view. So when you have 40 head of calves, you don't need to move them like 1 million times a day like the buffalo, because the cow is providing the food for the calf. The cow is this incredible manufacturer of milk that's just perfect food for the calf. And the cow, because the cow is mature, she doesn't need huge inputs of energy. She just needs a maintenance ration, and she feeds the calf. So it's a very different management for the cow-calf operation from the finishing operation. So in the cow-calf operation, if you made paddocks and you move the calves every 3 days. So 3 days is kind of like once you nip off the plant, cow nips off the plant, and it begins to regrow. It takes about 3 days. So if you nip it off again, you destroy roots. But if you were to move the calves every 3 days, it's a fairly comfortable rotation, low labor, low rotation. But once they go to finish, once you want these calves to get fat, once these calves have grown their long bone growth, they need energy, and they need energy all day long. So it's a very different management technique. And that's the reason we aggregate from the small farm and put them on a finishing farm. There's a lot of programs that have tried to go from birth to plate. A lot of people feel that's like the value, but it's like two different management techniques entirely. And the reality is most people have 40 head of cattle. You can't make a living on 40 head of cattle. So you do have another job. You sell tractors, you treat school, you do something else to make a living. And you come home at night and you throw bale hay to the cows or whatever. You take care of them, but it's not, you don't have the labor element to invest in moving them 2 or 3 times a day. So once they move to the finishing farm where they do need to move a couple times a day, all of a sudden you put together 850 1,000 animals, you can afford to pay the labor units to be there all day long and move these animals. So it's two very different kind of management techniques. And that's, I hope that explains it.
We have a question of, are there places in the West where the system can work, or is it only in the more temperate regions?
No, absolutely. It works. This is how the system works everywhere. Right now, the bulk of your cows are on a cow-calf farm. That farmer then sells the yearlings to someplace else, and then eventually they end up in a finishing operation, whether it's grain or grass. So it absolutely works in the West. It works all over the country. It's just this is the way the system works typically now. Is the calves, the cows raise the calves, and then the calves are moved to a backgrounding or finishing operation after that.
And a question about how your work is related to work done by Wes Jackson and the Land Institute, where they've been developing perennial grasses.
Yeah, I know Wes well. I met him like 50 years ago. Yeah, what he's doing is remarkable. It's very good. He's restoring the prairies with a perennial focus to make human food out of perennials, which is great. My feeling is that, so much of that original prairie could be put back to use as making grass for cattle that could be finished, on those original prairies. As I said, the advantage on those original prairies is, see, what we did to those original prairies, we moved the cattle off, and then what we did is that we plowed them up, and we planted them, and we created the dust bowl. And what happens to carbon when you plow it up? Carbon is very volatile, so carbon wants to find a way to recombine with oxygen and create CO2. So by plowing all those prairies, we put the carbon back in the air, and that's what's created the situation that we're in, the dust bowl and the flooding and on and on. But we could change that back very rapidly. That's the thing that's exciting. This change could happen in like 3 years. We could get those prairies back to fertile soils, and we've done. People are doing it all over the country. It can happen very quickly, but it requires a commitment on the basis of the customer to say, yeah, no, this is what we want. And so it's complicated. It's not easy. It's not an easy sound bite. We all know that. So it's challenging.
It's an easy burger bite, but not an easy sound bite. So people want to know how and where they get big picture beef, and can they buy it in bulk for their freezer?
Yeah. about the bulk for your freezer, but the places we sell it now, we sell it in the big wide chain. Big wide chain of stores, about 70 stores. They've been a very durable customer. We're going to be starting in about 2 weeks in the Hannaford supermarket chain. We sell to a company called Performance Food Group, which is a huge distributor that supplies colleges like UMass, Cornell, Ithaca College. All those places are coming online. So, there's a number of different places that you can get it. We don't have a direct-to-consumer option yet, but there are, we made the kind of decision to go and use existing retailers because as much as people like the farmer's market, they eventually go to the store. If we're in the store, maybe they can buy this option. So those are a couple places where it's possible to get the product.
And Max is asking how much land is necessary for a new farmer to make the AMP system profitable?
That's a good question. There's no real recipe. The fact is, most cow-calf farms are maybe 100 to 150 acres, and that would support 40 head. Because in reality, you have 40 mother cows, and then you have all the calves to maintain as well. Some of the land will be in trees, inevitably. The the finishing farms, we like to think maybe start out at 800 to 1,000 acres in order to get enough animal units on there to make the labor work. So if you had 1,000 acres, you could put 500 head on that. And now if you divide the labor of moving 500 head twice a day or something into 2 people, 2 labor units, you can make that work, depending on the cost of land, whether you can lease the land or put the land costs out.
Okay. Got some more here. Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you. My inclination is to give Alan Savory some credit for this whole movement. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Alan Savory is one of the ones one of the pioneers that kind of put the concept out there that you can actually reverse desertification by applying herbivores. And he's done it in what they call brittle and arid regions of the world with great success, Africa and out west and on and on. So his
brittle meaning areas that have dry seasons and wet seasons.
Right. And so it works. What's interesting is it works remarkably in the northeast of America, mainly because of the water and the quality of the soils we're starting with. So it's a huge advantage. Although the Midwest and the old prairies, what the research is showing is that the the results are remarkable. Like I said, Richard Teague is finding, from 4 to 5 times increase in biomass by grazing the way we graze. So, someone was asking one of the early questions, how do we measure carbon? And what I like to say is one of the proxies for carbon is what's above the ground. So in other words, if you have 4 or 5 feet of grass, inevitably you have 4 or 5 feet of roots. If you have 4 or 5 feet of roots, you have carbon below the ground. If you go to a golf course and you have 1 inch of grass, you have 1 inch of roots, you have no carbon. Period. You burned it all. So there's a lot of ways that we measure carbon, and the carbon is tremendous, tons of carbon. 4 tons per acre is a fairly conservative estimate how much we put down by grazing correctly. So it's a remarkable opportunity for us to get the carbon out of the air, get it stable below ground.
And one final question, which is actually a very interesting one. When people talk about soils, they're generally talking about geological creation of soils, the weathering of rock. And so you get about 1 inch every 1,000 years or so. But the biological creation of soils by animals grazing and pooping and creating all kinds of biodiverse life in the soils, you could get an inch a year of rich and fertile soils. Would you
Right.
care to
So,
comment on that?
yeah, no, it's absolutely all about the biology. And the biology breaks down rock, the biology breaks down the minerals in the soil, makes them bioavailable for the plants. So it really is about the plants. It's really about photosynthesis. And one of the reasons the herbivores are involved there is because, in order to have a situation where you grow tall plants, you have to have something to eat them. And the herbivores are the best possible scenario. But absolutely, it's about biological creation of soil. I mean, if you want to search Christine Jones, she's the master. She's from Australia, and she has pictures where she shows land side by side that was managed in these two different ways. And one way you put in 10 or 12 inches of topsoil over 10 years, and the other place nothing happened. So the opportunity is immense to create topsoil rapidly, but it's the biology. It's not rock eroding and turning into soil, that historic. And the other quick thing I want to say is, it's all about carbon. So if you think back to it, where did the fossil fuels come from? Plants and animals. It's all about carbon. So we have harvesting those ancient fossil fuels and burning them, but we have a methodology to keep control of the carbon. We all need carbon, but we need the right amount in balance. And the soil is the balancing possibility.
Okay, Ridge, I think we're at the noon hour, and I want to thank you very, very much for your enlightening presentation, and I hope everyone runs out and gets a grass-fed, pastured grass-fed hamburger soon. If you haven't lately, it tastes completely different from what you get in the regular package. And so thanks to you, and thanks to GBH
Thank you
for
all.
holding
Thank you all.
another
Absolutely.
session of Life Saves the Planet in collaboration with Biodiversity for a Livable Climate.
Great. Thank you all.